In this session, we will be going over the pivot table basics. This includes defining pivot table data dimensions, which is very similar to selecting data dimensions in the data visualizer. We will also show how to analyze data by quarters by selecting quarterly period types. We will demonstrate how to alter the pivot table layout, including defining your rows, your columns, and your filters. We will explore some pivot table options, including adding and removing subtotals, adding and removing blank rows from the pivot table, and adding and removing the organization unit hierarchy from the pivot table. We will also show you how to sort the pivot table values. We will save some pivot table favorites and clear the pivot table dimensions. This is very similar as when it's done in the data visualizer application. In this pivot table demonstration, we will also show you when using indicators for analysis is useful, compared to how we usually select data elements for our analysis in Datum. We will add in some age groups and show how we can define which age groups are cross comparisons between different data elements. We will also download pivot table data, including as plain tables, as well as a CSV or flat file format, which allows you to export the data into many different software packages. So in this particular session, we're going to go over the pivot tables. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in again as an analysis user. And then I'm going to load the pivot table application. So upon loading the pivot table application, you'll see the interface is very similar to the data visualizer. On the left-hand side, we have all of our data dimension selections. Up top, we have similar buttons: Update, Layout, Options, Favorite. We have tables, charts, and maps applications, which we can change between. So now we're going to go through the process of creating a pivot table. And it's very similar to creating the chart. The first thing we do is select our what aspect of our particular table. In this particular case, what I want to create is a table that compares HTC tests with the positive and negative test results. And I want to do this for quarters. So first I select my data element group. Now in this case, I want the HTC tests with the disaggregate results within the data element. If you remember when we were going through the naming conventions, we discussed that you must select the appropriate data element to include the disaggregates when you're running this type of analysis. So I'm going to select the data element with age, sex, and result within the name. I'm now going to select the period, and this time I want to select quarterly periods. I'm going to deselect my last financial year. I'm going to select quarterly as my period type. Note that I can use the previous and next year to navigate between the years. I'm looking for the quarters that make up my financial October 2014. So I'll click previous twice to take me back and hit next year again. And then I'm going to add in these particular periods. And I can select multiple periods by holding down Control on a PC or Command on a Mac. Now I'm going to select my organization units. For now, I'm just going to leave it as Demoland. So when I hit Update, let's see what happens to our table. We see the results and we see them displayed by quarters. Now there's quite an equal distribution between the quarters. Remember, this is training data, so it's quite artificial in that sense. But this is just to show you how to pull those kind of outputs from the pivot table. Now, let's say that I want to investigate this a little more and want to look at this by site. In order to do that, I do this the same way I did in the visualizer. I change my selection mode using this gear icon to select levels, and now I would select the site in country level 4. Now if I click Update, you'll see that the table doesn't change. Now just like we had a layout button in the data visualizer, we also have layouts in the pivot table that allow us to define how the pivot table looks. So if I click on Layout, you'll see how the table layout looks. Now I have the row as my periods, the column as my data, and my filter as my organization unit. Now one important difference in the pivot tables is that we can stack several data dimensions within these layout tabs. So for instance, I can have periods and organization units on my rows. I'm going to move period over just so I can have the periods as my columns. We don't necessarily need to have any filter in this particular case. So when I hit Update, let's see what that looks like. So now we have the period, we have the data element, and then we have some additional information. These are the row subtotals for this particular period. We also see this repeated here before the total. I would like to remove that from the table. In order to do that, I click on Options, and I'm going to click on Show Row Subtotals to remove this from the particular table. When I click Update, you'll see that it removes that particular subtotal from the pivot table. So now let's add in the negative and positive test results. In order to do that, I select the test results data dimension located on the bottom left side, and I'm going to add in negative and positive. Then I click on Update, and we'll see that the negative and positive test results have been added to the table. Let's look at our layout and see what that looks like. Now you can see we have several dimensions here. Let's just change things around just to see how that affects the table. I'm going to move data on top. And now we see we have a bit more of a compressed table for us to look at. So we can modify the table by using the layout and change the flow of the dimensions on the pivot table. We can also sort on this pivot table just by using the up and down arrows located next to the dimension. We can also remove one of the dimensions from the table so we can just see one of the particular dimensions on this table. And then of course sort by that particular dimension. We can save favorites just as we did before. And then of course add those to our dashboard later on if we would like. So if I want to clear this table and all of its relevant selections, I can do this the same way I did for my chart. So if I click on Table in the corner and click on Clear Pivot Table, it will clear all of my dimension selections as well as the table itself. So once that's done, I can now continue to create a different pivot table if I would like. In this particular case, I'm going to show you when indicators are relevant. We've been using data elements as raw data items, but this time we're interested in an indicator, which is a calculated value. If I click on Indicator, there is a group, DL All Indicators. This includes the indicators that we've created in the demo environment. You'll see HIV positivity percentage and HTC positive results, as well as the population density. So HIV positivity is also the HTC positivity percentage. It takes the numerator value, which is the positive results received, and divides them by the denominator value of the total HTC tests received, and then multiplies them by a factor of 100%. So typically indicators are made up of this numerator, denominator, and factor. So I'm going to leave the period as the last financial year. Now remember, we've selected an indicator, so that is our what aspect of this table. We do not need to necessarily select a data element, but we can of course include data elements if we would like. And then the organization unit, I'm just going to leave as Demoland. And we're going to go ahead and update the table. And you can see how that works. So we can also add in levels. We can do this for the districts. Change our layout. And now we have a table that displays the HIV positivity percentage by district for October 2014 financial year. So I just wanted to show you very quickly when indicators are relevant to use. We don't use them in all cases, but when we are looking for a calculated value, then we can use them, of course. So rather than reload the pivot table, let's remove some of our selections and create a new pivot table. So I'm going to remove the indicator selection, and now I'm going to select a data element. What I want to compare are the age groups in TX current and TX new. So you see here TX current with age and sex, and TX new with age and sex. So I'm going to select these two data elements in order to ensure that I can add the age dimension to this particular table. I'm going to keep the period as the last financial year. And I'm going to make the organization units just Demoland because I just want to compare the country-wide age characteristics. So I'll change the selection mode back to select organization units and leave Demoland highlighted. Now let's add the age groups. Now we know that in Datum, the age groups between TX current and TX new are not the same. When we want to, for analysis, compare age groups that have overarching categories, we can add ages from this all ages age group category or dimension and actually find out which age groups are the same between these two data elements. So I'm just going to rearrange these age groups just so they're in a little bit more relevant order. So let's go ahead and look at the layout. Right now we have the data and the ages stacked upon one another. We have the row as Demoland. Now since I'm only comparing the country, I'm actually going to filter the organization units as well. And I'm going to take the data and make that our row. Let's click Update and see what that looks like. Alright, so now we see which age categories are overlapping across these two data elements. So let's just compare the age groups of less than 1 and 1 to 4 because we know that that exists for both of these particular data elements. So I'm going to remove this selection. I hold down Shift and it highlights the top selection and my bottom selection by just clicking Shift and clicking on the end dimension point. I'm going to move that over by clicking on the blue arrow. And let's do this for all the sites. So I select my level and I choose in-country level 4. Let's alter the layout to make sure that the in-country level 4 or the sites appear. So I'm going to move that down to my row and I'll move the data up on top of my age groups. Then we hit Update and we have a look at the particular table. We can see once again the row subtotals have been included, and we can see where it might be useful to keep it in this time because it adds up the total from less than 1 and 1 to 4 for these particular data elements. Okay, let's go through one more example where we create a large table in order to extract data from Datum. So I'm going to clear this table again. Now that the table is cleared, we have a blank slate to work off once again. I'm going to create a large table so that I can download the data to my local computer. So we're going to start by adding some data elements. And I'm going to add the data elements with the disaggregates included, so we can also add some disaggregates to this particular table. I'm going to then select my period. I'm just going to leave it as my last financial year. And then for the organization units, I'm going to select sites because I want to take out as much data as possible. I'm going to add in a couple extra data dimensions. For starters, I'm going to add in the funding agency, and then I'm also going to add in sex as an additional data dimension. Let's click on Update and see what the chart looks like before I make any modifications to my layout. So this is not exactly what we wanted. We see this does not make a really good extract if you want to transport this out of Datum and download this to our local computer. Let's take a look at the layout and see how we can modify this table to make it look a little bit better. So firstly, we have the periods as our row. We're going to filter the periods since there's only one period present. We have the data, funding agency, and sex all pivoted in the column. Let's move that around a little bit. So I'm going to take the funding agency and add that to my row. I'm also going to take my organization units and add that to my rows as well. If I click on Update, you can see we now have a much more manageable table. There is, however, a lot of blank rows in this particular table. Data only appears in the sites in which each individual funding agency operates. So if there's blank data, it's good to know that that particular funding agency is not operating there. But we might want to remove those blank rows so the table is a bit more manageable. In order to do that, we click on Options, and I'm going to select Hide Empty Rows. You can see it's currently deselected. Then I'm going to go ahead and click on Update. We can see now that the table is quite a bit more manageable as it has removed those empty rows from the table. Now I'd like to actually take this data out of Datum. In order to do that, I can download this information to my local computer. I click on the download button and it will give me a couple different options. So for starters, I'm going to download this just as Microsoft Excel. When we open that up in Excel, we'll see what the table looks like. It's essentially copied the output of the data from the pivot table to this Excel output. This might not be exactly how we want the table to look, so let's go ahead and download this as a plain data source. Okay, so before I download this data as a plain data source, I'm going to add in the organization unit hierarchy. When I add in the organization unit hierarchy, it will allow me to see the regions and districts that are associated with the sites in the organization unit column in this particular table. So in order to do that, I click on Options, and then I will click on Show Hierarchy and update the table. Now we'll see that the regions and districts as well as the sites are displayed in the organization unit column. Unfortunately, the regions and districts are not in separate columns, but we can download this as a plain data source and actually manipulate the table such that the organization units are allowed to be in separate columns. In order to do this, we simply click on Download, and then we select this option, Plain Data Source with Hierarchy, and we select CSV format. CSV format allows us to bring it into many different software packages. This includes Excel or any other statistical software of your choice. So let's open up the CSV file with the hierarchy and see what that looks like. Now you'll see that we have the organization units separated in separate columns. Then we can of course create a pivot table, or we can export this to other software and run our analysis through that software as well. So let's review some of the concepts that we've gone over in this pivot table demonstration. We started off by going over the data dimension selection and noted that it was very similar to the data visualizer. We select our data element, we select our period, and we went over how to select quarterly periods by selecting the quarterly period type and navigating using the previous and next year buttons in order to select quarters that make up a financial year of interest. And then we select the organization unit, same way as we did before. We can also add in additional dimensions. We went over the pivot table layout. or we can pivot more than one dimension in a column or row, which is different than the data visualizer. We also discussed the table options. In these options, we could hide empty rows, remove subtotals, and show the organization unit hierarchy. We also discussed using indicators for analysis. And when we use indicators is when we're looking for a calculated value versus a raw data value of a data element. We can also compare age groups within Datum using the Age All Ages group. This allows us to compare data elements across the age categories and determine which age groups they share to allow for further analysis. We went over downloading the pivot table data either through a plain table layout or using a plain data source. This allows us to extract data out of Datum and use it on our local computer. So those are most of the concepts for pivot table basics. We're now going to get into the GIS module.